Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming out today. I'm Paul Barclay of the History Department here at Lafayette College, and today I'm going to give a short presentation titled, Where Do Indigenous People Come From? A case study from Taiwan. Now, for most non-Indigenous peoples, their knowledge about Indigenous people comes from popular culture, the news, magazines, etc. And these two photographs here, for example, come from a 2014 issue of the National Geographic magazine. On the left, you'll see two people of the Kayapo ethnic group in Brazil. They're eating a fish that they just caught in a river. They've cooked it over a makeshift fire built on a hunting trail. And on the right, you'll see a Kayapo person in a supermarket. He's shopping for his food. He lives in a village closer to town on the edge of the forest reserve. Now, this story is a familiar one, a culturally isolated and therefore interesting group of indigenous people face imminent extinction thanks to an expanding frontier and the attractions of modern consumer culture. But for historians, the notion that some people are original inhabitants of a place and that they've been isolated from everyone else until recently poses a riddle. For the history of the world is generally one of migration, interregional exchange, and flux. So historians wonder, why are some peoples indigenous and everyone else a settler, an immigrant, or an invader, even if such migrations and invasions happened more than 1,000 years ago? To answer this question, and to make a start on solving the riddle about how purportedly timeless peoples emerge in historical time, I turn to two well-known examples of popular nonfiction. And here we see some portraits from Jared Diamond's book, What We Can Learn from Traditional Societies, which for an academic historian would amount to a blockbuster. It's sold more than 30 copies. And so there's a lot of these out there. And we have portraits of people from New Guinea, Australia, Venezuela, Paraguay, Canada, and even, there was one more, Brazil. They're from around the world. Their portraits don't have names, but all of these individuals stand in for collectivities. And what do these societies have in common? Well, they're all homogenous and community-oriented. They have more family values and respect for elders than other folks. They are close to nature. They are knowledgeable about flora, fauna, horticulture, and hunting. They're self-sufficient, every one of them a MacGyver that can turn something into anything from nothing. They're in good physical shape. There's no diabetes. There's no obesity or diseases of affluence. On the downside, they're mistrustful of outsiders and have narrow cultural horizons, as Jared Diamond illustrates with this 1920s photograph of a recreated battle between Dani people in New Guinea. This is the war of all against all that supposedly characterizes these societies. Updating, we see the Kayapo of Brazil, here again represented in the National Geographic with a portrait of somebody in their state, the way they're supposed to be as an authentic indigenous person. And then we see the signs of contamination and market activity in an aluminum boat, a motor, and even a Gore-Tex tent. Now, who are the Kayapo? Well, they are an endangered species, according to the National Geographic. They have a warrior tradition, they're adaptable, and they use these traditions to fight development projects and protect a way of life. The people who live deep in the forest in this demarcated territory, which is a special administrative zone in the Brazilian state, deep in the forest, they can gather, manufacture, and take care of their own needs without outside assistance. But the people that live on the borders of this territory near the so-called whites are losing their knowledge, they're losing their identity, and their elders fear that youth, ever busy with their handheld devices, their cell phones, and their satellite TVs, are no longer real men. Now, we've probably seen this before if we're historians, and if we're attentive historians, we've seen things like Edward Curtis's photographs of Native Americans, which were taken in the early 20th century and depict, like National Geographic, like Jared Diamond, a variety of indigenous peoples who are represented by one person who doesn't necessarily have a name, but because these folks are internally homogeneous, one portrait will do, and these are so-called vanishing races, as Curtis thought. And each one of these races has a demarcated territory that's protected from the ravages of progress in a special administrative zone known as a reservation. Of course, the problem with Curtis's vanishing races is that the number of indigenous peoples is actually increasing, and the populations within each of these indigenous peoples is also tending towards the increase. So this is not an accurate portrayal, but it is a potent symbol, we'll say that. So where did indigenous peoples come from, and why are they still here? Well, many writers, including Jared Diamond, think they are living fossils. Technological, infrastructural, and political history has left them behind. They represent our past. Now, this model, it may have kernels of truth for some island cultures that live deep in mountain recesses, but for most indigenous peoples, this doesn't add up because contact with outsiders has been constant, long-standing, and transformative. Other anthropologists have theorized that indigenous peoples are, in fact, created in historical time. One of the theories by Edwin Wilson says that the marginal land, the isolation, and the relative poverty of indigenous peoples are results of expulsion from fertile land by settlers, and his study of the Kalahari Desert and the so-called Bushmen is a good illustration of this principle. James Scott has argued that indigenous peoples are people that have made a strategic retreat from the oppressive structures of hierarchical states, exploitative labor systems, and living in societies that are riddled with public schools and police stations. These theories, I think, make sense perhaps in exceptional cases, but I've offered a counter-argument in a recent book that I put out about colonial Taiwan. I think that Wilson and Scott can account for a few groups that were established during flight, escape, or refugee crises, but I want to ask, what about indigenous peoples who have long histories of cultural continuity but have not been isolated from the global political economy? They are not fossils, as Diamond would have it, but they have not been created de novo in periods of crisis, as Wilson and Scott would have it. And so my study of Japanese-governed Taiwan will show many of the same cultural artifacts that we would find in early 20th century North America. We find portraits of indigenous peoples, each one ethnically labeled and assigned to a reserved territory, like Edward Curtis's famous portraits of early 20th century the United States. However, if we go back further into the 19th century in the Qing dynasty, and I have maps here from 1818, 1874, and 1895, you'll be quizzed on the way out. These don't have indigenous territories on them. They don't have ethnic markers, and they don't have reserves. They basically have lines in the middle. On one side, it says nobody's really been here before. There be savages, and then on the other side is normal Taiwan, which normal being defined as Chinese in this case. So what happens is when a modern national state begins to enfold a territory into the apparatus of a modern system of property relations, it needs to create maps to create the legal basis for property transactions. At first we see just terra incognita in the 1895 map. In the 1905 census map, a great void where census takers dare not go for terrain or people with guns. And then we see a precocious filling in of the map by ethnographers and commercial agents that want to cash in on the global wave of primitivism and the new ethnological discourse on pluralism. Now, if we look at early photographs of the folks that would become indigenous in Taiwan, They are enemy combatants. They are savages. They are headhunters. They don't have any particular ethnic content, and they are not indigenous peoples yet. But as we look at the artwork and the commercial impulses and the academic impulses to take photographs of people that show these indexes of cultural contamination and participation in the market, and to airbrush them and to make them pristine, pure, and authentic, we can see in multiple cases this movement in ideology and art to create isolated peoples that are depicted as independent from the flow of time. Now, this ideological, artistic, aesthetic, and commercial impulse is coupled with actual military operations to create physical borders between normally administered space and indigenous reservations. And we see this being done with electrical fences, with armed guard lines, and a communication network. So when savages and enemy combatants become indigenous peoples, they are ironically dispossessed of the lands that they previously lived on, and they are moved to their eternal territories. Quite often, it's not 100% of the time, but it's a fairly common occurrence. And then lastly, from the 1920s forward, in the kind of global Wilsonian moment when people discover ethnic self-determination is a very widespread and hegemonic discourse, we find the demarcation of these ethnically pure territories, and they are invested from both sides. Outsiders find them as repositories of lost values, and insiders use them as cultural resources to defend themselves against states that would put them at the bottom of an economic hierarchy. So to conclude, I would say that indigenous peoples emerge in historical time, but their sources of ethnic identity precede these violent encounters with expanding states. Peoples are not created de novo. Natives, enemy combatants, and savages become indigenous people in stages. First, there's dispossession by settler states. The demarcation of territory is external to the realm of law and property rights, and there is usually the denial of an ability for these folks to deal with other governments independent of the overarching ruler. Scientific, commercial, and literary investment of dispossessed peoples as past versions of us is the timeless element. In other words, these folks become timeless using the time of the outsider. Internally, that valuation of time and progress is a non-starter. And lastly, these new legal categories of domestic dependent nations, special administrative zones, and reservations create the political and legal and physical containers for indigenous peoples that live in the world today. Well, that's my time, and thank you very much.